Steven, I am really excited to talk to you because I think out of all the divisive issues that are really difficult to bridge across either at home or in our community or in the workplace, politics has just gotten out of control.
Yeah.
I mean, everything has been politicized. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask. Send the kids to school, don't send the like it's in like and so it almost has become like don't talk about any topic if you don't want to get into a heated debate about politics. And
That's right.
unfortunately that is just not the way it should be. So you believe that that's not the way it has to be.
That's right.
You've built an entire organization around this belief that we can bridge across the political divide. So why don't we start there? Tell us a little bit about your organization and your whole like why for starting.
I think back to when we were together at No Studios and you sharing some of the experiences you had of bridging differences, and I was so moved by that. And the spirit you shared then is exactly why we started Millennial Action Project. We launched back in 2013, and I grew up here in the greater Milwaukee area, seeing political and racial divides up close and personal. But I also saw the avenues in which we could transcend those divides through real trust and relationships. For me, the best and most powerful vehicle I found was music. I played in every type of band you can imagine. I had a rock band, multiple jazz groups. I even had a klezmer band. And a lot of people don't know what klezmer music is. If you don't, definitely look it up.
Okay. Is it even legal to integrate all those genres?
I know, exactly. And my bands were like a motley crew, each one of them of that cultural spectrum here in the community that doesn't usually come together. And I remember we would play shows where the audience would look at us kind of surprised that this type of fusion could even happen in one place. So that really got me fired up, and it led to the DNA of Millennial Action Project, which is completely focused, as you mentioned, on bridging the political divide through the activation of young leaders. And the second part of that equation is premised on the idea that the best investment we can make in changing the future is by training and developing young leaders who can emerge out of this darkness with a totally new paradigm of collaboration. And part of the why question, as you asked earlier, was not only seeing through music how we can bridge divides in really creative ways, but when you look longer term at this country and perhaps even in the world, the future of humanity, the need for diverse democracies to function well and thrive as our world becomes increasingly interconnected is absolutely essential. And that was really what America is supposed to be. And that was one of our greatest exports around the country, is the idea of a multicultural, multi-religious democracy where we, out of our diversity, can come together, reconcile our differences, and advance the public good. Part of that methodology, which I hope we can talk a bit more about today, is just like in a jazz group where you have different perspectives converging and you're iterating, you come out with a new artistic creation, it's better than what you would have otherwise had in isolation of each other. And that methodology has been proven to be true with Millennial Action Project, whether it's on our safe voting initiative, our criminal justice reform initiative, on climate change efforts. Having this dynamic exchange of conversations, listening and learning and co-creating solutions together leads to a better result. And we have to build the case for that.
All right, so Steven, you sold me on the vision. I get that. But in practical terms, is it possible, right? So you see a lot in your lens in the sense that you're working with young people who are getting into politics. And so tell me, are you seeing that vision actually play out? Is it possible? Because I'm not seeing it anywhere. I'm not seeing it in my conversations with family members or friends. I'm not seeing it, certainly not on TV. So are you actually seeing this ability to bridge across political differences? And, based on your viewpoint, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
I often talk about the difference between the headlines and the trend lines, because we know when it comes to headlines, if there's a saying that says, if it bleeds, it leads, because it's all premised around a business model of conflict. But I am hopeful for the future, because when we reached out to, as an example, our young lawmakers and leaders here in Wisconsin to say, we need to strengthen our absentee voting system to ensure we can vote in this pandemic. This is just one of a few issues we focus on. We heard from not just Democrats, but Republicans and independents who wanted to join together on that. And because of that consensus we helped to build, our state was able to strengthen the absentee voting process. Voters this last week and this week are receiving in the mail absentee ballot requests, just because we had built that consensus. That would not have otherwise happened if not for that type of agreement we helped to build. And if you're unregistered, you're going to get a postcard saying how you can register to vote. So the point is, we have found these areas of agreement. And I think it's not that we all have the same ideas or the same perspectives, but when we have a shared goal of how we can vote safely in our democracy and open the conversation to hearing from people who might not otherwise be part of it. And trust me, in the voting rights conversation, we often miss a lot of people. We learned, like Millennial Action Project learned a lot through what we called it a listening tour. We discovered our own blind spots, and we're able to enhance our messaging, the way we frame the issue, in order to get this kind of consensus. So that type of methodology, which I'd break down into A, building trust, B, reframing the issue, and then C, executing against this idea, I think can be applied to a lot of different aspects in our life or different issues that we work on.
Yeah. So I love how you called it a listening tour. Actually, that was one of my strategies in business whenever I started a new job. I just said, you know what, I'm not even going to jump to strategy or execution, which is kind of like the default. You want to get to action right away. But I always went on a listening tour where I just literally spent time talking to people at all levels of the organization to kind of inform my thinking. All right. So I have a provocative question for you. So you said, with the voting, access to voting and voting registration was like one common theme that people wanted to come around. So just between you and me, like, which side is more willing to lean into these topics with the spirit of empathy and understanding and listening and compromise and collaboration? Which side? The Republicans or the Democrats?
Well, actually, I have some concrete data I can share with you, because for 2 years, Millennial Action Project hosted a red and blue dialogue series across the state of Wisconsin. We were in Milwaukee, Sheboygan, Green Bay, Madison. We were all over the place, including my hometown of Brookfield, which was a really fun discussion we had. And it was modeled off of having local state representatives who are Democrats and Republicans, and then seeking to invite a cross-partisan group of community members to join the dialogue. And typically what does happen is that when you put out a call for a dialogue, there is often an immediate kind of selection bias towards people who lean liberal. And to kind of balance out the partisan balance, you might have to do some intentional recruitment. But I think what we also learned is that the language.
Just pause there.
Yes.
Why do you think that is? Do you have any hypothesis, like why?
I think a lot of it is, I think there are two dynamics I think at play. One is simply the language that we use. I think sometimes when people hear dialogue, for example, they wonder, are we going to get brainwashed to all think one thing? And maybe we found that community conversation, or there are other maybe better examples of language that can help to attract a different audience. And again, going back to our blind spots, sometimes we don't even recognize that our language can create a bias in who decides to attend an open event. So that's one key thing. And we've learned through the data that actually, if we do this series again, we probably may not call it a dialogue. We might call it something else. The second dynamic is, who are your community champions? Who are the trusted conduits of a meeting of this sort? And one reason I think we are successful in achieving this cross-partisan or nonpartisan group of people truly from across the spectrum was because we had recruited local champions. Many of the times they were our local state representatives who've been involved in Millennial Action Project, or maybe they're part of the local chamber of commerce or the local tech college. They could go out and invite people, and through their networks, people will trust them that this is a worthwhile conversation that's not going to brainwash them. In fact, they might actually learn something new. So I think that's really important. And then I think the group that's hosting it needs to have true bipartisan credibility. I think too often we hear about nonpartisan groups, but they actually advocate for one side or the other, or their funding or their board membership is clearly slanted. And so we've taken extra effort at MAP to make sure we do have that political balance. And I think the credibility then lends to people willing to really step up and participate, and sometimes stick their necks out in order to show that they support this type of conversation.
All right, so I hear trust and credibility really matter. You still didn't answer my question. Who leans in more, Democrats or Republicans?
It's a good question, but I do think that I can think of many examples right now of, Democrats who are open-minded and closed-minded, Republicans who are open-minded and closed-minded. The language used is often different, from, well, maybe we'll get into this later in the conversation, but the kind of rationale for cooperation or hatred, honestly, can come to the same place with different language, whether you're more from the right or from the left. So it's hard to say one or the other.
So not politics, it's more personality based than right.
Could be exactly. I think a lot of it, if I just to add one more quick thing, is how people, it's just, and this in business, like how important does the first impression matter, right? In that first few seconds, you're starting to place that person in a certain construct.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens in politics, where if you immediately see the D or an R next to their name, you start to associate all of these things with them that they may or may not, believe. And one of my favorite examples of where that matters is we hosted a dialogue on criminal justice reform, had a table that we intentionally curated. And one of the women comes up to me afterwards. I knew already that she was one of the most furthest left, liberal activists. And she comes up to me and she says, "Hey, Steve, I really enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was, really well done. I just had one issue." And I said, "What's that, ma'am?" And she says, "I just thought my table was agreeing with each other way too much. And I think you would have benefited from more political diversity." I said, "Well, thank you so much for that feedback. But I just also wanted to share with you that you were sitting next to the local head of the Republican Party, and also at your table was the local head of the right-wing Americans for Prosperity."
One of the reasons why I think helping people lead with more empathy and understanding that is really difficult is because sometimes you have to be able to go through sort of the different stages of grief to embrace another idea that is not your own or challenge your closely held beliefs. There's a sense of loss involved, right? And so you sort of go through the stages of grief. First, it could be denial, and then anger, and then sadness. And anyways, those are all yucky, negative feelings that people just don't want to experience. So that's why it's easier to just not engage. I don't want to hear your point of view because I don't want to challenge my own.
Right.
When you see people actually in the moment of dialogue, do you see people kind of going through those stages, or how have you seen people be able to move through those initial negative emotions to get to the other side of more understanding, empathy, even enlightenment, because it
Hmm.
does mean that you're challenging your own beliefs, and therefore you gotta like quickly in the moment process through them. Do you see that happening
Hmm.
real time?
Yeah, I think that's a profound point, this kind of multi-stage process. I think it's variable based on how high your wall or your guard is up at the beginning of the conversation, because I've seen cases where that exact dynamic takes place, often starting from a more antagonistic type of setup where someone is truly challenged. And initially they're in that denial, but then through either sustained conversation or perhaps they hear something later, it leads to this greater empathy and understanding, something that really kind of shakes them to the core. Like, wow, I didn't think of it that way. But at other times, I've seen where the beginning of the conversation can help to set up a smoother process, where at our dialogues, we had really well trained facilitators who at the beginning set up a set of kind of agreements, norms, and really set the tone to have kind of this open conversation. And I think that led to a lowering of their guard and an opening of their ear and mind. And I think when they heard a contrasting viewpoint, it wasn't as disorienting, and they were more able to kind of hear it, think about it, and say, you know, I didn't think about it that way.
Yeah. Is there maybe like one super practical suggestion or tip that we could take from your excellent facilitators to maybe create the environment that's more conducive for productive dialogue? Like one thing you mentioned that I already heard is leave labels, titles aside. So, you know, maybe when people are coming together in a room, don't introduce them according to their label, title, maybe political affiliation or whatever. So people don't already put them in a box. Is
Yes.
there one other like practical thing that is easy to do that you see work really well when you create that environment?
Yeah, definitely. Avoid blanket statements that generalize a large swath of people, because usually that leads to a an overgeneralization about people. And if someone you're talking to fits into that archetype that you've articulated, they might be thinking, well, I don't really believe that. Like, that doesn't describe me well. And then you're already fraying at the fabric of trust in that process.
Right.
So I
So,
remember in one of,
so don't ever start a statement saying the blacks.
yes, exactly.
Here's what the blacks probably think.
Exactly. And that dynamic is disproportionately a problem in politics when it gets so sliced and diced into, this is what black voters want, this is what Hispanic voters want,
Right.
Asian voters. And the pollsters really cut it up in that way, when, as you and I both know, and your listeners know, that it's much more complicated than that. So I think that's really a practical step, is avoiding those blanket statements. And I remember we actually had this list of, we called them agreements, that everyone at the table would agree to in terms of the approach. And I remember one of them related to this said that try and use I statements, like you're just represent your own personal feeling, because then one, you're not painting with too broad of a brush, and two, I can hear you directly as a human being, and as opposed to some other
You
abstraction.
said early on when you were talking about sort of your why and how you became interested in this whole topic of bridging across differences. Um, so you had mentioned sort of, you know, growing up in Brookfield. So you're Indian American, you're growing up in Brookfield. So you're already a minority in that community. Do you think that people who are minorities or marginalized have a unique ability or sensitivity or maybe skill set and even interest in
Mhm.
bridging differences because it's just ingrained in how we've always had to operate? That's my own hypothesis. You can tell me yes or no from your personal experience.
Yeah, well, I think, if you grow up as an extreme minority, meaning you're very different from everyone else around you, then you have to choose, like I did growing up in Brookfield, which at the time when I grew up was more, culturally, I mean, it was probably about 98% Caucasian. That percentage has since gone down as the suburbs have increasingly diversified. But you really have to choose. Are you going to kind of just isolate yourself, or are you going to build connections? And I eventually, with the benefit of music, honestly, chose the path of trying to build connections. And so I do think that forces you to ask questions about your own identity at an earlier age and think about how to create dialogue and conversation and understand where people are coming from. So I think that does lend itself to this type of practice that you're speaking of. But I also think I had this when I went to college at UW-Madison. I'm a proud Badger, and I was right in the middle of campus conversations on race and diversity. I was the diversity chair in student government. And, when you get to campus, there is a collision of people who grew up in highly urban areas like Milwaukee and Chicago, where they're used to being around people of color. And then you had people coming from up north and rural farm areas, all converging in Madison, Wisconsin. And I think for people who come from the majority population, I think one of the inhibitants to participation is feeling like you're the villain, like you've done something wrong. And so if you're already painted as the villain before you've stepped into the conversation, then that just doesn't, that's not an inviting space. And then you add on top of that, if you use the wrong word or you say something accidentally, then you are definitely labeled a villain in that scenario. You just feel like, you know what, it's going to be easier if I just do something else with my time. And so I think if we can have empathy towards people who are coming from a variety of backgrounds and familiarity with conversations on race, then I really do think we can move the needle. I mean, at the end of the day, how much change do we create if we're always preaching to the choir? I fundamentally believe we create change by growing the coalition. And that's something that Dr. King really believed in. He knew that, especially amidst many others saying that you needed a more militant approach. He said, we will succeed because we have recognized the dignity of all human beings and that we've created a multiracial, multi-religious coalition for civil rights. And that's radical in many ways because, how do you do that when sometimes your own humanity is being denied? But he knew that this radical form of bridge building would lead to a changing of minds. And that's what I believe. I think you really move people by changing minds, changing hearts. And that's how we can create real change.
Yeah, and it starts with inviting everyone in and not villainizing, I don't know if that's a word, anybody, but starting with a place of inclusion in the conversation about diversity and inclusion. I don't know, something that I personally struggle with because I want to be hopeful about the future. But I on my day-to-day, I don't see a lot of signs of us healing and coming together, particularly around politics, let's just say, in this country, because I think the media works so much against that, right? So I always thought I would love to have a TV show where you have people from two ends of the political spectrum, but before we sign off, they have to agree on something. Yes. And I pitched the idea not really pitched it, but I suggested this idea to somebody and they were like, well, that's boring. No one's going to watch that.
There you go.
But for ratings to get us agitated and mad. And that's, so knowing that these huge forces of media are against that ability to have boring conversations around commonalities, and that we don't have, I feel like we're raising a whole generation of young people who don't even have examples of what that looks like to be able to have healthy, respectful debate. How are we going to work against those big forces? Is it possible with these individual conversations that you are facilitating and leading on this, these micro levels? Do you feel that it can shift?
Absolutely. I often use the metaphor of, if you look at the evolution of cars over time, we've had gasoline, powered motors for so long. And now we're seeing the advent of electric cars. And those electric cars, people are increasingly drawn to them because they're better. They not only have better fuel economy because you're just charging up your car, it's cheaper to operate. There's virtually no maintenance, and you have greater performance, greater acceleration. And I would make the same case for a bridge building conversation. I think it's better in every respect than a conflict driven one. And the reason for that is, in a conflict driven conversation, you're not learning anything new. You're not building any degree of trust. You're not moving the needle on any issue. And from a pure entertainment standpoint, would you rather hear from someone who's really going to surprise you, or tell you something you already know, or you already knew that they're going to say that? If you look at cable news, for example, they always have the split screen, right? Well, you already know what the liberal person is going to say. They're going to agree with what the Democrats are doing. You already know what the person on the right is going to say, because they're going to try and defend Trump or at all costs. And that, to me, is just not entertaining. I think what is entertaining is when you are surprised with some kind of new idea that's unexpected. And I think for those of us who want to be independent minded in politics, we have to forcefully build the case for why that is a more dynamic and exciting type of political conversation. And it has the benefit of leading to better results. In the same way that you might think of like a Tesla looks better and it performs better. And in the case of our dialogues, it needs to feel and look better in terms of the kind of entertainment standpoint and its kind of excitement and the dynamism of it. And it's going to perform better in terms of creating real change on issues.
I like that. And I guess I come to it maybe from a purely less philosophical, interesting, intellectual point of view, which is, I feel like leaning into anger is exhausting. I find when I finish watching the news, like I have to take a week-long break. Like a part of me thinks we're just I'm hoping that we're just going to exhaust ourselves, and we're like, oh my God, I'm done. Like I can't even sustain this anymore.
Yeah, there's real psychological research that totally backs that up. I mean, it's like expressing your empathy for another person makes you happier as a human being. So if for no other reason, just out of pure self-interest, you might want to express empathy because it's going to lead to a better sense of well-being for yourself. And Dr. King spoke about how having this hatred in yourself for other people contorts your personality. It contorts your compassion. It distorts who you are as a human being. And so by trying to openly express love and empathy, you're going to become kind of a truer self of yourself, and you're going to be happier at the same time. If you just continue to have this anger, like you said, you're eventually going to burn out in some way, but it's much, much healthier to go down the path of understanding and empathy.
I love it. Well, you have really helped me to feel a lot more optimistic about this topic of politics in this day and age. And Steven, I think if anyone can help us get to better, it's you. I'm now going to think of you as the Tesla of all political conversations.
I love it.
That was a great analogy. Thank you so much. Keep up the great work that you're doing.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me, Beth.